I would request Dr. Lakshman to just say two words because I think he has taken the entire burden from KSASI, though KSASI took the initiative of starting this program. I think he's the main man who actually gave a lot of shape to it and he designed the models and all. So we only gave a little push from KSASI because we wanted this program. So Dr. Lakshman, please just say a few words about
Thank
it,
you.
how you feel, how it started and all that. Please
Thank
go
you,
ahead.
Dr.
Thank you.
Sopiamat. I'll keep it very short because I know that Shivaram and Ramakrishna are going to do a great job to follow us. The main motivation for this was the kind of abstracts we used to get for our annual conference at the state chapter. We found that there wasn't the kind of scientific material that one would expect from postgraduates in their abstracts, either in the form of the studies that they were doing or in the format in which the abstracts were sent. And rather than criticizing them and rejecting those abstracts and things like that, we thought it best to try and educate them about what is expected of scientific study. And more importantly, we found that we need to familiarize our youngsters in the process of a critical appraisal of a paper, which forms the backbone of evidence-based surgery. So with that in thought, we put together 4 major modules. The first was an introduction to evidence-based surgery and why people need to follow that. Second one is basic statistics. The third one is critical appraisal of a paper and how to hold a journal club. And the fourth one is about drawing up a protocol and conducting a study and perhaps writing a paper as well. These are the broad outlines of this brief workshop. And we have excellent faculty who have been working with us. We're very fortunate to have them. I wish them well and hand it over back to Sopiamat to say a few words before Shivaram takes over. Thank you.
Well, as you rightly put, Lakshman, that it was our interest to take it forward, and a lot of colleges and faculty also showed interest, and we thought that it is better that we train our faculty also, because many of them did not know how to guide their postgraduates in this regard. So I think it's been generating a lot of interest. Many faculty, practicing surgeons and all that have taken this. Even if they don't produce a research paper, definitely it will change their outlook towards the way they look at the literature, they look at the clinical problem. In that way, it's been helping many people. And it is, of course, picking up very fast. Many colleges are coming forward to host it. And we have again scheduled web program for many of the college faculty and students now. With this, I would request Shivaram to take it forward. I thank ILS for having joined us in this program and take it forward across the country. Thank you all.
Thank you, Dr. Sopiamat. Dr. C.S. Rajan is the moderator. Sir, you have any few words or Dr. Rajan?
Yeah, good evening, everybody, and thanks for having me here in the traditional role of being the moderator. Yes, we have, Dr. Lakshman has said what I have to say about the need for such kind of introduction and knowledge sharing among the younger surgeons and the postgraduates. We cannot stop thanking Dr. Lakshman for putting together these modules so that they can be explained in a very simple way. Evidence-based surgery is the backbone not only of clinical practice but also of all forms of medical literature, and how you produce literature, and even if you don't produce, how you analyze and accept what is given in the literature is important for our making decisions for the future surgical work. Now, this first module will be by Dr. Shivaram, who is going to take us through what exactly is evidence-based surgery and why we surgeons need it. It is the expansion of more the word that I have used, I've already said. Followed by that, we have to have a basic introduction into medical statistics. Dr. Ramakrishna has written a nice book for medical personnel and on medical statistics, so we don't have anybody better than him to tell us how these basic statistics are used and applied. If there is a little more time, he will also touch upon the differences between research and audit and what they differ, how they are influenced in our daily lives. So without wasting more time, I request Dr. Shivram to take over and start with his first session. Now, please note, all listeners, kindly put in your questions into the chat box. You type them in, and as the progression goes on, we will be answering them. The important ones, the relevant ones, we will definitely answer. The speakers will not be interrupted during their talk, but will be questioned at the end of the talk. So kindly list your questions. I've got a note down, and we will be able to answer all. Between Dr. Lakshman, myself, Dr. Sopimat will try and answer all the questions. Right, over to you, Dr. Shivram.
Thank you, Dr. Rajan. Uh, Special thanks to Dr. Patta Radhakrishna for hosting this EBS program in the LGS platform. So my task is very simple, to introduce this to all of you. Following this, there will be extensive talks today by Dr. Ramakrishna, next week by 2 more speakers. I'm sure all of you know this man, Thomas Friedman, a great economist, author, and commentator. He was in Bangalore.
Sir, you need to share your slides on the screen.
Not coming.
No, sir, not yet.
Okay, I will quit and share once more.
Well, this is exactly how things happen even in surgical life. You may have all the plans and all the ideas in your mind, but when it comes to a particular patient, the implementation relies all and how the evidence that you have in your mind that will help you to take the correct decision. So this is exactly the reproduction of a real life situation where we have the technology, we have all the equipment with us, but that evidence that we are connected and being shared on screen has not yet come through. So while they do that, Dr. Any other comments you have, Dr. Lakshman or Dr. Sopi, anything to say?
I would just like to add that the impetus for practice of evidence-based surgery has to come from the people themselves. Somehow, particularly in the surgical fraternity, we feel that that we are unique. Each one of us is unique, and that somehow in our hands things work well, and somehow we feel that we may be better than others, and things like that. Such views of individual opinions have a very low value as far as evidence is concerned. And so all of us must endeavor to have numbers that are dependable, so that we can quote those numbers and justify our actions. Over to Shivram, please.
Yes, sir, your slides are ready.
Yeah.
We can see it now, Shivram. Over to you.
Can see, okay. Sorry for that problem. Okay, what he basically said was that we have a level playing field. The world is flat in that sense, that whatever is being done in USA can be done in anywhere in the world. Now you see that even software engineers are, during this lockdown and this corona period, they are staying at their home, even villages, and they are doing the work which is being done anywhere in the world. So we have a level playing field thanks to internet, software, computers, everything. And also we have equal opportunities which comes with great responsibilities. So we see that the rest of the world is moving ahead and there is a level playing field. When we come to surgeons, can we say this especially about Indian surgeons? So let us look at this about the Indian surgery. This was the work done by Dr. Lakshman and his group, contribution of Indian authors to global surgical literature. You see that we form about 1/5 of world population. And India, we have about 75,000 surgeons, and the Association of Surgeons of India there are registered about 27,000 surgeons. So, and ours is the second largest association of surgeons in the world after the American College of Surgeons. But what is our scientific output to the surgical community, to the rest of the world? You see these statistics, JAMA surgery in the last 2014 to 2020, no articles from Indian surgeons. Annals of Surgery, 1 out of about 1,338 articles. British Journal of Surgery, hardly 1 article. World Journal of Surgery is slightly better. Even our own Indian Journal of Surgery, only about half of the articles are from Indian surgeons. So you can see this, there is a large gap, and this is our present status. Even compared to China, which is not an English-speaking country, so our publication less than 30% of theirs. Not only that, if you see the medical institutions, great learning centers, 57% of medical institutions do not have a single publication. This is what Das et al. Found out in 2018. So it's such a sad situation, but if you go past and see, India was always on the top of the knowledge production and also widely providing it to the rest of the world. At present, we are only consuming the large knowledge, especially the surgical and medical knowledge provided by the West, and our contribution has become very less. So there is a need to reverse this trend and train our younger colleagues and surgeons so that they can do better work in the field of literature. If you see the goals of surgical training, it's not only to just produce surgeons, we need safe surgeons, evidence-based surgeons, thinking surgeons, and ethical surgeons. So this is not basically not possible. Only few people or few institutions take interest. So we know that the medical colleges, the DNB institutions, and the All India institutions, everybody is doing their best, but there is a role for association like us to chip in and try and help our seniors and also junior colleagues, especially the new entrants to the surgical field, the postgraduates, to do their dissertation, and also for the faculty to help them to guide their juniors. We need such kind of evidence-based workshops in our country, and I'm sure if it goes all over, there will be a change in the field of our surgical literature. So coming to what is research, we all know what is search and research. We keep on searching in the Google and the internet. That itself is not enough. And a lot of people have an opinion that research can be done in a big laboratory or in the big institutes like the Indian Institute of Science or All India Institute of Medical Sciences. That is not true. With the level playing field of internet available, lot of research can be done just by having your laptop, and of course the medical patients and the literature, whatever is available at the place of our work. So this creation of new knowledge and or using the existing knowledge in a new and creative way, so that the new concepts and the new methodologies and understandings will come up. So this is what is the need of the hour, and there will be always some knowledge gap. We can cover that, and every scientific advancement occurs in a small step, which each one of us can help to progress the knowledge. So to come to the evidence, so all of you know, without evidence, nothing will be accepted. See, providing facts or information to support what the hypothesis we say, or to say that or counter the hypothesis, the evidence is very much required. And this evidence comes from sound scientific data. It's always better we have our own data to support the hypothesis or the new knowledge we provide in the form of research. So data collection and also data providing is very, very important. So the surgical practice should be evidence-based, it should be data-driven, and there is need to have our own data, which by audit and research, this is very important to have our surgical practice. So Albert Einstein said, once you stop learning, you start dying. So learning is a lifelong process, especially for surgeons when we have to take care of our patients. The adult learning process has principles, has many things. It should be relevant, it should be goal-oriented, it should be practical and task-oriented, experience-based, focused on problems, and it should be able to apply to the clinical practice what we do every day, and having a mutual trust and understanding, especially with our patients. There is slight difference between research and audit. Research always has a hypothesis. So this is what our postgraduates and all do, and methods to test that hypothesis, and ultimately we have results to prove or disprove it. Audit has no hypothesis. It measures performance against set standards, which are already set by the international authorities or so, and it proposes improvements. Basically, it is to improve the whatever process we are doing. So research to produce something new knowledge. So Dr. Ramakrishna will deal with it if there is time. So next is why we should do research. Without inquiring minds, medicine will stand still. So all of us have experienced it. Robust research tools needed to evaluate one's practice. This is what Modi et al. Said in the BMJ article in 2016. There may be different motives to do research. It can be egoistic or altruistic. Most of the people are altruistic, and basic aim is to disseminate knowledge and do research activity in their field. So it can also be because of the academic promotion in the many of the institutions, professional promotions. A lot of the promotions are related to these research activity, improve the knowledge and judgment. Also, once you start producing these research papers and publishing, so one will become famous. You can compete with the international standards, so contacts all over the world, and occasionally there may be some financial gain also in some of the production of these papers. So it's important to document the work, improve the standards, conform to international standards. Whatever knowledge gap is there, it can be filled up by research. And ultimately, self-improvement, definitely you are very familiar with it. It is not just the one or two issues. It is the judicious use of current best evidence and combining with the individual clinical expertise, ultimately which can help our patients in their betterment. So we have to use not only the external evidence and the best current practice. Also, it should be integrated with the individual clinical judgment. But most of the time, what happens is over the years, as surgeons, we start neglecting the external evidence and the research work. Then many conferences, you see that this is how I do it. This is what my senior said, professor said, expert said, and this works very well in my hands. All these things will start. So, on a lighter note, in the BMJ article in 1999, they criticized all these things. There were a lot of, whether it is evidence-based medicine, eminence-based medicine, the vehemence-based medicine, all these things were discussed. Many, they said surgeons are more to confidence-based medicine. So these are the changes we want to try to bring out in our colleagues. Science, if you see the this definition, it is to substitute facts for appearances and demonstrations for impressions. Just because we see something, appearance, and we create impressions, that should not become science. It should be facts-based and also demonstrable. It should be able to demonstrate. If you see any of the papers or studies, so how you assess it, we should look at as how recent is the study, what is the type of study, what type of literature it has been, and what is the value of the study, and what is the grade or level of evidence. So let me come to this in a little bit of detail in this. If you see how recent it is, so if you look at textbooks, they may not be, the knowledge in the textbooks, they may not be very recent, because to produce a textbook, it takes some time, sometimes 3-4 years also. But if you see the conference papers or presentations, if they are based on their original work and research, they will have the current and the recent knowledge, and the other things come in between. So this is how you look at how recent is the knowledge which has been produced. Type of studies, there are two types: descriptive study and evaluative study. The case reports, case series, cohort studies, these are all descriptive type of studies. The randomized controlled studies are all evaluative studies. So there are two types of studies. The literature, it can be primary literature or the secondary literature. If you want to look at the treatment efficacy, we always look at randomized controlled studies. Diagnostic accuracy, again the controlled trials. Prognosis of a condition, you can look at the cohort studies. Etiology of a condition, again you can look at cohort studies. And the preventive measures and the quality improvement, we look at basically the randomized controlled trials. So this is how we look at the primary literature. The secondary literatures are one which are most of the time derived from the primary literature, whether it is systematic reviews, the meta-analysis, the critically appraised topics like what we see in UpToDate, where the topics are appraised and then given to the readers. Decision analysis or decision tools. And during this COVID era, we saw a lot of practice guidelines and the consensus reports and statements. They all derived from the primary papers and put it as the secondary literature for us to easily understand them. Then coming to the value of the studies, highest value is given to systematic review or meta-analysis. Then the randomized double-blind studies, single-blind studies, then the prospective studies, retrospective studies, and the anecdotal experience. So if you see this pyramid also, it is produced here. The highest value is for the systemic review and the meta-analysis. If somebody says, this is my experience, this is how I do it, they have very little value because that is not peer reviewed or not published. So this is how you look at any value of the studies. Then the levels of evidence, all of you are aware of this. So whether we can say as a grade of recommendation or the levels of evidence, and the highest level of evidence is again the systematic review of randomized controlled trials. Then it comes down and the individual opinions and reviews, they have less value in these levels of evidence. So another thing we have to understand is when we put a paper to publication or anything, they are all peer reviewed. So peer reviewed, when we say, it goes through a process like the experts in that field, they will analyze and see whether it is good to produce and publish and put it in the knowledge domain. After author submitting the article, the editor can look at it. If it is not good, he may straight away reject it. Or if it is, he can send it to reviewers. So many reviewers will look at the article and give their opinion. Sometimes they may say that it has to be revised. So it can be revision, and the manuscripts may be again produced, again given to the editor, and he may again send it to review, and finally it can be accepted or rejected, and then it is published. So that's why when you submit an article for publication, it may take some time for all this entire process to be done and then finally accepted or rejected. Another thing which we have to know is about the clinical trials. Basically, it is for drugs and all. Basically, to understand, we can say that there are different phases: preclinical phase, then the phase 1, 2, 3 and all. Preclinical phase is basically done for the safety and activity of the drug. It is done in the laboratory, in the animals, and then it has to come to the phase 1 trial, basically for the safety and dosage. In the small number of volunteers, it is tested. Then effectivity and toxicity, it will be tested in large number of patients, about 100 to 300. Then final phase is the phase 3. There it will be tested in the thousands of patients, and it requires little longer term also. Even after that, the phase 4 trial, post-marketing, for the long-term safety and cost analysis, everything will be checked. So if you see this, how a new drug or anything takes long time to come, and sometimes there will be an attempt to make this shorter because of the market interest, which is not actually correct. So in the phase preclinical trials, there may be thousands of compounds, but ultimately when it comes to the market, it may be 1 or 2 compounds. So this is how the research of new molecules, new drugs will take long term, and also it's quite expensive process. So this is what we have to understand about the clinical trials. Then steps of getting evidence. These are all will be again emphasized in the next week's talk also. I will just touch upon them. Especially important for the postgraduates to make their dissertation, or for surgeons to look for their research project and produce scientific papers. we have to ask the right clinical question in the beginning itself. What is that we are going to look in this research project or the dissertation? So ask the right clinical question. I will tell you how to ask the right clinical question. Next is search relevant literature. Again, this will be taught next week. And the critical appraisal of literature. Very, very important that we should critically look at whatever scientific paper comes out of it. Then apply this literature to your patient. It's very important. So we make a pro forma, everything, and then apply this literature and knowledge to our patient population. Then finally, evaluate, keep data, everything, and finally, make it as an audit paper or a research paper or your dissertation. So this is how 5 steps of getting evidence and finally coming out with a good paper or an article. How to ask the research question? So there are different criteria. This is called the PICO or PICOT criteria. You look at the population, that is patients. What specific patient population are you interested in? If you are doing a hernia, so you have to take different patients. If you are doing some such research on the colectomy, it will be different. And the interventions in the studies, what is your investigational intervention? Whether it is surgery, whether it is some other form of evaluation, and the comparison group. What is the main alternative to compare with the intervention? Whether it is the previous research or you have 2 groups of patients. So comparison group, then the outcome of interest. What do you intend to accomplish, measure or improve at the end of your research? So that is outcome of interest, and then time, especially the follow-up period, how much it is, how long to follow up. All these things should be very clear when you are starting your dissertation or the research project. So this is the PICOT criteria. There is another criteria called the Finer criteria for a good research question. So again here, you can see F is for feasible, whether the study is feasible to do under your settings in your institution or so, whether there are adequate number of patients, adequate technical expertise to do that project, affordable in time and money. And so you may have 2 years or so for your research project, and the manageable in the scope what you have defined. Second thing is whether it is interesting, whether you have something new to say, and especially when you come to the novel, whether it confirms, refutes, or extends the previous findings. So you have to add something to the knowledge, or you have to produce something new. And whether it is ethical, so it has to go through the ethical committee, which has to approve it. And finally, whether it is relevant to scientific knowledge, to clinical and health policy, and also for the future research. So all these things we can look. So if you look at these 2 criteria, definitely it will help us to find out a good research question and also to finally produce a good paper. Again, what you have to look at is, once you do all these things and you come and sit and analyze the results, we have to see whether the results are valid. So was it randomized, whether there were dropouts in the work you did, adequate follow-up is there, and the intention to treat is violated. I'm sure all of you know what is intention to treat. That means whatever you have, the number of goals or patients you have used in the initial, it should be assessed till the end of your project. So there should not be in between, something should not change, or some dropout should not be there. If there are things, those should be included in your study. whether investigators are blinded or not. So patient groups, whether they are similar when you're comparing with the other group, and treatment other than intervention is equal or not. It's called the confounding factors. That means you have started a study and everything going on in between, something else getting added to those, like some other treatment, or patient starts something, some other medication or so. So those are the confounding factors. They should be not be there, and they should be eliminated in your studies, what you are doing. Next thing is to see whether you can apply this to your patients. Are my patients similar to the study group? Was the outcome relevant? And are my skills, infrastructure similar? So you may see a lot of papers, read everything. Then you look at the research paper and see whether that can be applied to your clinical practice or not. So ladies and gentlemen, the EBM doesn't involve not only just a simple process, it comes out of individual clinical expertise, the best external evidence, and also the patient values and expectations. When we put together everything, then only it becomes the evidence-based practice or evidence-based medicine. There are some limitations to evidence-based practice. Even today, we see that lot of evidence practice is abused, and as I said, eminence-based medicine still persists, and there are a lot of pressure on the investigators and researchers that many times it should become a advertising tool, and the fundings, they may try to manipulate the research and creating grants and favors. And a lot of, basically during this COVID era also, you saw that how the research papers were twisted and the wrong message went to the public, how the medical research can be manipulated and wrong conclusions can be drawn. That's very unfortunate. But evidence-based practice has definitely shown a lot of improvement in the outcomes. Better application of knowledge and also changing physician behavior is definitely possible. Just you can take an example of the antibiotics use itself, the prophylactic antibiotic dose, even single dose is enough. But even today we see, even for a simple surgery, many people continue antibiotics post-surgery, even if there is evidence is produced long back. So those are the changes we have to bring it in our practice. And once we start evidence-based practice, surgery, things should change. Sometimes it can be not be applied properly. There may be good evidence, everything. As I said, the phase 2 trial results are clinically applied. Many times it happens in the medical oncology, and because of the pressure from the pharmaceutical companies, the endpoints may not be evaluated critically. Like many of them show the like a tumor regression, or you see the secondaries in the liver comes down smaller by the CT scan or the MRI, but it may not be making much difference for the patient's quality of life or the longevity of the life. So those are certain things which we have to look into these evidence-based practice. So finally, as Sackett told in 1996 itself, good doctors use not only the clinical expertise and the best available external evidence, and none of them alone is enough. We also should take the patient's interest and their well-being into consideration, and then continue our evidence-based surgery and evidence-based practice. So this is a small, short introduction to what is coming in next few talks. So thank you very much for the patient hearing. So over to Dr. Rajan.
Thank you, Dr. Shivaram. That was nice, brief, and special. As we can see, there are no questions in the chat box. That means that everybody is kind of understanding and knowing how you have laid it down. Yes, evidence-based practice is the key thing for, or the guide word for all of us. However, we have one small little problem, as you have rightly mentioned earlier, the authenticity and the truth behind the delivery of the evidence. There are lots of factors that act behind our back, starting from political, financial, and personal gain, that make even reputed journals fall victim to such temptations and give us the articles which are not exactly the evidence. But it is important to note that in a court of law, in a legal issue with a patient, it is the reference to what is currently available in literature that is used as evidence or the guidance for the current best practice. And so it is important that we all learn how to do it, the methods we do it, and follow these methods into our practice also. So thank you, Dr. Shivaram. I still don't find any questions. As they come up, we will ask them to, I will put them forward to you.
Right.
We now need to have a basic understanding of statistics. And statistics are very, very crucial. As I have mentioned, there are three types of lies: simple lies, damned lies, and statistics. You can always manipulate statistics to produce the untruth. We are not interested in that. We are interested in knowing how to understand basic statistics and the idea of dispersion, correlation, significance, deviation are all words that we hear. And more importantly, we see them as pictures, as statistical representation of data. And when you cannot interpret those pictures, you lose more than 75% of the message that is being conveyed. So to make things a little more simple, I request you to listen now and invite Dr. Ramakrishna, a senior surgeon from a remote, smaller, second-tier city of Karnataka, Bhadravati, where he is doing yeoman work as a surgeon and is contributing so efficiently and successfully into medical literature. So he has the motivation to do it. We all should take it up from him and follow his steps. Thank you, Dr. Ramakrishna, for being here. I now invite you to take over and give us the basic outline of medical statistics as it is relevant for the person reading a journal, as well as being able to criticize the article and also use it in his basic research and theses. Dr. Ramakrishna, please.
Thank you, sir. Good evening. I thank Dr. Shivaram and Dr. Patta Radhakrishnan to invite me for this and share my views. Just yeah. Sir, my screen is visible, sir, now?
Yes, yes.
You can make it full screen. So, yeah, fine. Fantastic.
Yeah. Good evening. So, my topic now is to tell you something about the basics of medical statistics. So, most of the surgeons, they think medical statistics is something very difficult, and they say it is a kabbina the kadal and like that. So, it's not so. If you try, you can understand it. You need not bother about the calculations. Calculations part we can always do with the calculators, which are available freely and some of them are paid. Those things I will touch upon. What I want to tell you is you have to understand it. If you don't know, then this is what happens to us. No matter how much of resources you have, if you don't know how to use it, you will end up like this. All he needs is a single ladder, and he has plenty of them. Still, he is struggling to see. This is how the resources are wasted. So you must know the basics things. We better call this medical statistics as biostatistics, because the same principles applies to other biological fields like agriculture, veterinary science, dental science, any biological field, the same principles are used. So this is called biostatistics. The definition of biostatistics is the science of theory and methodology for acquisition and use of quantitative evidence in biomedical research. Please note this, quantitative. You cannot assess the qualitative data in statistics. For example, pain increase, pain decrease. It doesn't. You cannot assess these things and quantify them. So, in order to quantify, you should convert it into some numbers with the help of various scoring methods like visual analog scale. For consciousness, you have got Glasgow Coma scale. All these things. So with that, you have to convert the qualitative data into quantitative data. Then only you can apply biostatistics. This is one of the basic thing here. So what all it deals? The biostatistics deals with the statistical methods to analyze your data. So you will come across various tests of significance when you read journal articles, and sometimes the moment you see some calculation, you just move away from it. You don't try to understand. That's what the problem is. So what I want to stress is try to understand how these tests are applied. What does it mean? How to interpret it? That's all we need to know. The calculation part you need not bother. That's what is the most difficult part, but with the use of software applications and calculators, you can easily calculate any of these tests of significance and p-value. So that's what I wanted you to appreciate here. So basically, let me first refresh your memory about some of the basic statistical terms. The measures of central tendency are mean, median, and mode. Mean, you all know. If you have some, number of observations, just add them all and then divide it by the number of observations. So that gives you the mean. If you arrange your data in an ascending order or a descending order, the central observation what you get, that is the median. Among the data, which data is recurring most number of times, that we call mode. For example, if you take 100 patients pulse rates, if 72 is occurring 10 times, mode means that is higher than any other value, then mode will be 72. That's how we interpret. Similarly, you also should know how the data are spread across a range. It is not enough to know how it is moving towards the center. You should also know how it is spread across a range. The range is a very simple term. We just say this patient's age in this study from 10 to 20, 20 to 80, something like that. But what happens, one patient may be 10-year-old, rest are from 40 to 60 years. But when you are mentioning range, you are mentioning 10 to 60. It gives a wrong impression of dispersion. So in medical statistics, more often we use standard deviation. This is the formula. It is difficult to remember or calculate. Don't bother about it. I will just show you how easily you can calculate all these measures. So this is my website. I have created lakshminh.in, and one page I have dedicated to medical statistics here. So click over this. This page opens. Here, many items are there which are useful for research methodology and statistics. Here I have created a statistical calculator. You can see here. Click over that. This is the same enlarged view. So one Excel sheet gets downloaded. Just open it. It looks something like this. All instructions are given here. Here some default data are there. Just for calculation purpose, I have put it. Delete them and put your data here. Anywhere below this thick brown line, anywhere in this range, put your data. That's all you have to do. You have got ready-made calculation here. you get mean, median, mode, standard deviation, variance, confidence interval at 95% from 2. So all these things are readily available. That's all. All you have to do is put your data in that calculator. That's all you have to do. And calculation part, the software will take care. The one concept you have to understand for all basic statistics is the normal distribution curve. Here, the word normal is not used in the same way what we use in medicine. In medicine, if a value is not normal, we say it is abnormal. Whereas in medical statistics, it's not so. The standard normal curve is a term used to describe a type of distribution. That's all. If the data doesn't follow normal distribution curve, it doesn't mean that they are abnormal. It is another type. That's all. The data, if it follows normal distribution curve, we call them parametric data. So parametric data is the data. Normal distribution curve is the curve you get after plotting this parametric data into a curve. Those are the two things. This is a typical normal distribution curve. It rises slowly and decreases slowly. It's a bell-shaped curve, bilaterally symmetrical, and it has got certain characteristics. If you calculate the mean, median, and mode, all of them, they coincide in the center. This is one important characteristic of a normal distribution curve. The other characteristic is if you take two standard deviations on either side of the midline, that means two standard deviation this side, two standard deviation this side. It covers 95.4%. That means 95% of the data will be falling within the two standard deviations from the center. So the chances that data falling outside two standard deviation is less than 5%. This less than 5% is an important number in medical statistics, which forms the basis for p-value. I will come to it a little later. In contrast to normal distribution curve, this curve is not bilaterally symmetrical. More data are falling on one side than the other side. So this we call skewed distribution curve. This is a right-sided skewed distribution curve. Similarly, we can have the mirror image of this as a left-sided skewed distribution curve. If you calculate mean and median, they do not coincide here. They fall towards one side of the curve. They are not in the center. So this type of curves we call skewed distribution curve, and the data which follows this type of curve we call non-parametric data. Then the another concept we frequently come across is the natural variation. This is what initial period of my practice I used to get confused. To understand what is natural variation, let me take a very simple example which you are all familiar with. Just toss a coin. How many times you get heads if you toss 10 times? We all know expected is 5 times. So, but if you actually toss, you may not get 5. You may get 6, 7, 8, or in extreme case, you may get 9 heads also. But that doesn't mean that you have got a supernatural power like Shakuni to get more number of heads. This we call natural variation. So to make it more understandable, what I have done is I have tossed coin 100 sets. One set means 10 tosses, and in each set of 10 tosses, how many times I have got head. So this is what I have tabulated here. Please note, only 52 times I got perfect 5 heads. Rest of the times it was different numbers. Even once I got 9 heads. Please note this. Whereas what is expected is all the 100 times you should have got 5 heads. This is what expected, and this is the actual. The discrepancy between this expected and the actual, that we call natural variation. It is because of the natural variation. In our experimentation, it was easy because we knew the mean. Out of 10, we have to get 5. This mean we knew. So the conclusion was easy in our experimentation. But in the actual clinical trials, you don't know what is the mean. If you take 100 people and estimate what is the pulse, you don't know. So once you do it, then only you will come to know. For new things, you will not know what is the expected mean. So what you need a control. So you have to divide the group into 2 groups, and control group, you are not putting any intervention. And there, whatever mean you get, that we take it as the expected mean. and the mean of the study group should differ from this control group mean by certain extent, then only it is acceptable. The mean of the control group is taken as the expected mean, and mean of the study group must differ from the mean of the central control group in order to be effective. That means if intervention is effective, the mean of these two groups should differ. Not only differ, it should differ by a certain amount. The mean of the control group is 50 and the mean of the study group is 52. That doesn't mean that the intervention is effective. It should differ by certain amount. What is this certain amount? So now the concept of p-value comes here. What is the basis of this p-value? What is mean? How to interpret it? And why we should calculate? Let me take another simple example which you can understand. One Mr. X says that he is able to predict the gender of the baby just by feeling the pulse of the pregnant woman. He feels the pulse and he says you are going to get male baby or female baby. This is what he claims. But if you want to test him whether he really has got that capacity or not, how to do it? You must conduct an experiment. Give him 100 pregnant women, ask him to see the pulse and record what he is going to do. This should be a prospective one. That's why the prospective studies have got better value than retrospective studies. Here, he has to record it and follow those patients, pregnant women, I mean. And anyway, after delivery, you know what is the gender and compare it. Now, if his prediction is correct in 50 out of 100, will you accept he has got a capacity to predict the gender of the baby? See, these workshops we used to conduct for various medical colleges. When I asked this question, almost everyone said no. If he is correct in 60, a few people kept quiet and some they said yes, no, all those things. 70, again, some problem. If it is 90, majority of them kept quiet. They didn't know what to say, whether to accept or not to accept. If it is 98, everyone accepts. Yes, he has got the capacity. The problem is at what number you accept his capacity, means he has got the ability to predict. Well, that depends on the level of confidence you want to have in your conclusion. If you want your level of confidence to be 90%, then his prediction should come true in 90 out of 100 cases. That is 90% of cases, his prediction should be correct. Then you accept he has got capacity. Otherwise, we reject it. So this 90 is an arbitrary number we have kept before starting the experimentation. You can keep it at 85, 95, 98, or any number you can keep depending on the level of confidence you want to have in your conclusion. In biostatistics, most of the time, you want to have confidence more than 95%. So more than 95% means it is okay to err in 5% of cases. That means if you want to be correct in more than 95%, then even if your conclusion is wrong in about 5% cases, it is okay, we accept it. You convert this 5% into decimal point, it becomes 0.05. This is the meaning of P is equal to 0.05. If it is less than 0.05, we accept the difference is significant. If it is more than 0.05, we don't accept it. We say it is statistically not significant. Again, I want to stress here, please note that this 0.05 is an arbitrary value we have fixed because we want 95% confidence in our conclusion. Sometimes you can keep even higher also, 0.01, like that. How you calculate p-value? It is through the tests of significance. But all the tests of significance, basically they have got one thing in common. Initially, it assumes that there is no difference between the groups it is testing. That means we call this null hypothesis. That means there is no difference between these two groups. If this is true, what happens? The mean of the control group and mean of the study group, or if there are more than two groups, mean of all the groups, they will be equal or somewhere around the equal, and difference will not be more than 95%. So if it is less than 95%, then p-value will be more than 5%. That means more than 0.05. So this is what expected. So when we calculate p-value, if it is more than 0.05 or more than 5%, we accept null hypothesis, and the inference is that There is no difference between the groups. On the contrary, when we calculate p-value, if it comes less than 0.5, then we reject null hypothesis, accept alternate hypothesis, and the inference is that there is difference. Our hypothesis, the null hypothesis, was wrong, and there is difference between these two groups. This is the basic thing in all tests of significance. Okay. The another important thing is, lesser the value of p, stronger the validity of the result. If p-value is 0.05, it has got certain validity. If it is less than 0.01, then the validity is still stronger because p-value is less. These are the commonly used tests of significance you come across while reading journals. But this is not the end of the list. There are many more. For basic understanding, this much I am going to deal. Let's take it one by one. One is chi-square test. Chi-square test is used to find the difference between two proportions. That means proportion like 16/42, 10/15, something like that. So the data will be expressed as a proportion. Two data will you get. So this type of data, chi-square test is suitable. It calculates the p-value, probability. Please note, you cannot apply chi-square test for all types of tables. There are certain prerequisites, certain conditions to apply chi-square test. The table should contain actual numbers, that is raw data. It should not be average or percentage or anything like that. It should be raw data in the table. Then only you can apply chi-square test, and all the cells of the table must contain certain minimum value. For a 2 into 2 table, it should be more than it should be more than 5. For 2 into 2 table, all the cells should contain more than 5. If for 2 into 3 table, it should be more than 2. This is one of the conditions to apply chi-square test. If you apply chi-square test without these conditions, the test result is invalid. Another important thing is the data should be categorical variables. So if you get confused what is this categorical variable, I'll just explain it. What is a variable? Variable is just a data, what you are going to collect during your study. It may be pulse rate, blood glucose level, male, female, gender, like that, mortality rate, recurrence rate, all those things. These are all the variables, what you are going to study. There are various methods of classifying them. One important, the broad and basic method is to categorize them into categorical variable, continuous variable. These categorical variables can take only definite values. They fall into definite categories. That's why they are called categorical values. For example, if you are studying the mortality, patient can either survive or he dies. There is no third possibility. Only two possibilities are there. If you are considering the gender, it can be either male or female. There are no other possibilities. Means the number of options are only limited and it is definite. Whereas if you consider continuous variable, it can take any number of values, and sometimes it takes value in between two values also. For example, these are the examples for continuous variable. If you take age may be 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. That means it is innumerable. And in between 11 and 12 also you can have 11.1, 11.5, 11.76, like that. So that means the possibilities are infinite. So this type of variable we call continuous variable. So to apply chi-square test, the data must be categorical variable. That's one important thing. If you look at this table, here you cannot apply chi-square test because the data is containing percentages. You cannot apply chi-square test. The data must be raw data. For this table also you cannot apply a chi-square test because this is a 2 into 2 table and one of the value is less than 5. So again, if you apply chi-square test for this table, the conclusion will be invalid. For this table, yes, this is perfect. All the conditions satisfy here. So you can apply chi-square test for this type of table. So I will take one practical example to show you how to calculate. Now, if you understand what is chi-square test, when you should apply, how to interpret, this is all you have to know. How to calculate, don't bother, it is very easy. I will just show you. This is a table I have taken as an example. Again, same, Lakshmi NH.in. Here here links to useful calculator. Click over here. It shows a number of calculators are here. One of them is Chi-Test. Okay, click over this. It opens this web page, and you can change if you want the captions. Group 1, group 2, it is written here. What I have made drug A, drug B, infection, no infection. Now I have entered the data here. Okay, and it is asking what is the significance level you want. 0.05 is the default value. You can change it, but for medical purpose, we always keep it at 0.05. So let it be there, and click here, calculate chi-square. That's all you have to do. Just enter the data, click over, calculate. It is already giving p-value 0.02. That means it is also giving interpretation. The result is significant at p-value 0.05. So it is as simple as that. If you don't know how to report it, here's one more tab is there. Click over this. It will show you how to report this chi-square test results. One important thing I wanted to stress is our table was looking like this, 159 and 22. But when you are entering here, infection 22, that means no infection, 159 minus 22. So here you have to write 137, not this 159. Here row total, the calculation, the software itself will calculate it. So after calculation, it will come to 159. This one important thing we usually make mistake, because we look at the table like this and we enter the data directly, we will get wrong p-value. So here what you should ensure that this total value should tally here. One criteria I said to apply chi-square test, all the cells of the table must be subjected to certain minimum thing. That means if it is less than 5 in a 2 into 2 table, you cannot apply chi-square test. Then what you should do? You can apply Fisher's exact test. This test can be applied regardless of how small the frequency is. However small the expected frequency, still you can use Fisher's exact test. Rest all conditions of chi-square test apply here also. Means this is similar to chi-square test, but only thing, the expected frequency is not a criteria here. For example, if you look at this large number of cases, you have got Fisherization 1 and 2. Here, obviously, you cannot apply chi-square test. So you have to use Fisher's test. Same calculation is again very easy. You understand the concept, you can calculate easily. Link to useful calculators. Here, there is a calculator for Fisher's exact test. I have entered the numbers and click next. That's all. It gives the value as 1. That means P1, that means which is more than 0.05. So the result is not significant. Okay. So all this time I was talking about the categorical data. Now we shall consider the continuous data, continuous variables. If you have got a continuous variable, what test you have to do? The student's t-test is suitable for this type of data. Simply we call t-test. Okay. It is used to calculate probability between two normal distribution curve being equal or different. That means you need two sets of data. It should be parametric data because it is mentioned normal distribution curve. The data should be parametric. You need two sets of data and it will compare those two. This is what I was telling. Continuous variable, it should be continuous variable. It should be parametric. These are the two basic conditions there. This is an example table, the number of days from the onset of pain to surgery in perforated cases and non-perforated cases. You have got two sets of data and you want to see whether there is significant difference in the duration between these two groups. So you can apply t-test. You can show the data like this also, means the data what I have shown here, this can be shown as mean plus or minus standard deviation. If you can show your data like mean plus or minus standard deviation, then t-test is suitable. This is what this picture shows. If your data is presented something like this, 16 by 42, 5 by 10, like proportions, then either Fisher's test or chi-square test should be used. This is the summary of these two. Calculation, again easy. In the same website, here I have put one tile t-test unpaired. I will just tell you what is this one tile and pairing, all these things in next few slides. First, let us take one tile t-test. So this calculator is open. This I have made an Excel sheet. So you also can do it. It is very easy, but this is a ready-made calculator. Two columns are there. Some default data are there. Delete these data and put your data in this. First set of data here, second set of data here, and just click enter, press enter. You get the p-value here, calculated readily. So calculation part is very easy. Don't worry about it. Understand the concept and when to apply what test. That is more important than calculation. Okay. Sometimes for each subject, there are two data. Means a pair of data will be there. Then you have to use pair t-test. What an example. The other conditions to apply pair t-test is same as t-test. Means the data should follow normal distribution curve. It should be a continuous variable. These two conditions remain same. When this type of test is useful, per subject you have got two observations. For example, you have done a surgery to reduce the weight, bariatric surgery. Each patient will have two data, one weight before surgery, one weight after surgery. So each patient will be having two data. That means one pair of data. So use pair t-test. Another example, you have done surgery for pain relief in chronic pancreatitis. Each patient will have pain score before surgery, pain score after surgery. That means each patient is having one pair of data. So pair t-test is useful in this. There is a calculator for paired t-test also in the same website. I don't think I have to repeat and show you. It is simple. You follow the instructions given there, it can be done. So the one condition to apply t-test is that the data should follow normal distribution curve. That means it should be parametric data. If the data or the variable is non-parametric, following skewed distribution curve, you cannot use t-test. You have to use Mann-Whitney test. So this type of curve, skewed distribution curve, then you have to use Mann-Whitney test. Again, there is a calculator for that also. It is simple. Just visit the calculator. You will understand how to use it and you can definitely do that. I was talking about tile. There are two types of t-test, one tile t-test, two tile t-test. So many times you may be reading this type of words while reading the journals. One tile test is used, result falling on one side of the range is tested, and two tile when both sides of the range are to be tested. So little bit confusing. I will explain it to understand it better. What are the tiles means? This is the tile. If you take the range, whatever falling at the end, that means outside the significance level, this we call tile. Here you have got only one tile. Here you have two tiles. Let's take one example each so that you understand it better. Suppose you are considering or comparing stapled hemorrhoidectomy with conventional hemorrhoidectomy. In the end, what could be your conclusions? Either stapled hemorrhoidectomy is better than conventional hemorrhoidectomy, or conventional hemorrhoidectomy is better than stapled hemorrhoidectomy. Both these conclusions are possible here. So you have to use two-tile test. That means you have to test both these possibilities. Which one is better? Either SH is better or CH is better. You are testing both the possibility. Go for two-tile test. Consider this example. You have used some antibiotic in the preoperative prophylaxis of wound infection. So here, antibiotic group will have lesser infection rate, or it doesn't have lesser infection rate. Antibiotic group having higher infection rate is meaningless. You need not test this possibility. That means you are testing only on one side. You are not testing whether antibiotic group will have higher infection rate. So you are testing only on one side. Go for one-tile t-test. This is the difference between one-tile t-test and two-tile t-test. That's simple. This is the summary of tests of significance. I have put it here. Again, to stress it again, t-test, you need two sets of data. It should be continuous variable. It should be parametric data, and the data can be expressed as mean plus or minus standard deviation. Then t-test is suitable. Pair t-test, similar thing. Only thing, for each subject you have got one pair of data. Chi-square test for proportions, it should be categorical variable, and the it should be raw numbers, not percentages or averages. and it's subjected to certain minimum. Okay, and Fisher's test, same thing, but there is no condition that it is subjected to certain minimum. So this is the summary of tests. There are other tests also we can use. Sometimes what happens, after reading or hearing so much, you get confused. What test is useful for my data? For that also there is a solution. Here again same thing, link to useful calculator. Here there is which test to use. Click over this. It opens this web page. Here start, some description is given, just read it, you will understand how to use it. Click over start, and it asks certain questions. What type of data you are dealing with? So this is the what type of variable you are having, it is asking. So nominal is another word for categorical variable. If you don't understand it, what you can do is click here, click for an explanation. Okay, when you click it, it gives explanation regarding that option. So after reading this, you will be able to answer that and select one of those options. And once everything is chosen, then it will suggest one test. For example, for the data what I have given, it is suggesting chi-square test. Okay, and it is also suggesting alternatives. You can also use Fisher's exact test or Z test. Okay, this is how you can decide what test you have to use for your data. While conducting our workshop previously, we used to get more questions on these three things. So I have added a few slides on this recently. One is power of the study. What is power of the study? Power of the study is the ability or the power of a study to detect a difference if there is a difference really. That means there is a difference, but your study is not able to pick up, then power is less. If there is a difference, that means if there is some effect, the study should be able to pick it up. That higher the ability, higher the power. That's what it means. That means how good your study to minimize the false negative. If power is very high, false negativity will be very less. Ideally, the power of the study should be around 95%, but what happens if you increase the power, it leads to large sample size, because sample size depends on the power of the study. There are many other things which decide the sample size. Power of the study is one of the factors which decide the sample size. If you keep it at power very high, it leads to large sample size and it may be difficult to complete your study. So practically many of the studies, they keep the power at 80%. The second thing is sample size. Sample size, how many subjects you want to involve in your study. This is a question lurking in the mind of many new researchers. There is a calculation for that. The sample size depends on the type of the study. For survey, it's a different. For comparative study, the sample size will be different. For survey, usually lesser number is required. For comparative study, you need a higher number of subjects. Also, it depends on what type of variable you are dealing with, whether it is categorical variable or continuous variable. And most importantly, the expected frequency of the effect. If mortality is 1%, you need certain sample size. If mortality is 10%, you need about 1/10 of that sample size. Also, if you are comparing two groups, the difference between them, that is also important. If the difference is, say 5 and 7, difference is only 2. 5 and 10, difference is 5. So if the difference is more, you need lesser number of patients. If difference is small, to demonstrate the effect, you need a larger number of patients. And it also depends on the p-value. Usually this is fixed for our purposes, so we don't bother much about it. And power of the study, this you can fix. If you want 95% power, the sample size increases. If you want 80%, the sample size will be comparatively less. So how to calculate? Again, the same website. Here, the links to useful calculator you have here. This is the sample size calculator. There are two types, one for comparative study, one for the survey. So let me take this comparative study, because this is what we are doing most often. This is also asking certain questions. You have to select it, whether you have got two independent groups or you are comparing one group versus population. This let me take this two independent groups. Then the type of data, whether it is dichotomous is another name for categorical data. If category are only two, then we call dichotomous. Or is it a continuous variable, what you are dealing with? So I have chosen dichotomous variable here. And the expected frequency. This is what the most important thing here. Many times you don't know what is this expected frequency. For example, if you are calculating the recurrence rate of hernia in one group and in another type of surgery, say laparoscopic group and open surgery group, you have to get these numbers by reading other articles which are previously published. So there you are likely to find some expected frequency, use them, put it here. Or if you don't know what you have to do, you have to do some pilot study for some time, maybe 6 months or so. Then what is the frequency you are getting in these two groups? So that's how you are going to find this these numbers. So now I have put expected frequency as 5 and 7. This is what I have chosen. This is, I told you, this 0.05 is the p-value, and power of the study I have set at 80. Just click calculate here. You get the number here, sample size number. That means you need, for this difference in the expected frequency, you need 2212. So many numbers of patients in each group. That's the total sample size will be more than 4400. That's how you calculate the sample size. The other thing, other question usually asked is how to randomize. There are many types of randomization. Just tossing a coin is the simplest way, because you have got 50% chance of head or tail. If you get head, put him into one group. If you get tail, put him into other group. So this is one simple thing. You can also use random number table, but it has got certain disadvantages. So the best thing is computer generated randomization. This is the best. You have got so many options, and it is totally avoiding the bias. So that is very useful. How to do? Again, the same thing. Link to useful calculator. Here one randomization. Okay, randomizer.org. This website, it gives how to randomize. This is the website. Again, it is asking certain questions. What are the, how many sets you want? That means how many number of patients are there in your group. That is the number of sets, and allocation each time. So each time you are going to allocate only one patient. So put one here. And from 2, how many groups you have got? If you have 2 groups, you put 1 and 2. If you have 3 groups, 1 and 3, like that. So all these things you can answer. If you don't know, here there is a help. Click over that. It gives some explanation. After reading that, you can choose what is the right data for that. So I have put my data here, 100 patients. I want to allocate one patient each time, and I have got 2 groups. So I have put 1 and 2 here. And whether it want to be unique, no. All these things you put. Now click here, randomize now. It gives random numbers here. You can also print it. Here there is a option to print it. It gives something like this. Here it is, so many patients are there. For the first set means first patient. First patient you put him to group 2. Second patient put him to group 1. Third patient again 1. Fourth patient 2. See, this sequence, it is totally unpredictable, and because it is computer generated, the allocator, he doesn't have any bias over allocation of the patient to each group. That's how this randomization avoids allocation bias. That's why it is useful. So my purpose here is to explain you the basic concept. You also can read it further and you understand how and when to use, how to interpret. That is more important than actual calculation. For actual calculation, there are various softwares. You can use them. Most of them are available freely on the net, and some of the paid softwares are also there, like SSPS, which are available in most of the medical colleges. Because I am in a small place, I cannot pay. So I have found out all these free calculators and made a compilation of those to present this. Thank you. Thank you for patient hearing, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Ramakrishna. That was as typical of you, giving us a very simplistic account of what sounds like a very complicated topic for us. But nonetheless, it is the beginning of the adventure into medical statistics that we all have to go through. I haven't got any major questions here. Let me just check the chat box. Yes. there are a few somebody about radiological diagnosis of breast lesions where surgeon and radiologists have done something. I can't get any question out of it, but anyway, if necessary, kindly contact Dr. Ramakrishna and you'll get that answered. Any other comments, suggestions, Dr. Dr. Rajgopal Shenoy, please go ahead.
Sir, thank you very much. Congratulations to Dr. Shivaram and Dr. Ramakrishna. I will put it as a unique kind of a initiative, sir, and it is required. It is for you have spoken. Shivaram has spoken from the angle of surgeons, and Ramakrishna has spoken in the angle of postgraduate students. I was trying to compare. When we were students, hardly any importance was given to this, sir, which is typically a very, very, very well organized British systematic way of getting the things done. That's what I will put it that way, and which is definitely useful. But in the meantime, there may be some limitations of getting for evidence-based science or whatever it is, because of our educational system all over is in a different colleges are in a different way. Some of the departments they may not have the teaching statistician at all. See, for example, and research grants, and then the number of patients, and whether the patients you have to put it evidence. It has to be for each patient randomization. So these are all very technical difficulties. But nevertheless, sir, wonderful, Shivaram. And for Ramakrishna, you are all the time telling simple, simple, simple. But ultimately it is the interest and attitude of a learner is important. Because I say chess is very, very simple. But once you start playing, others will know. Similarly, Bharatanatyam. So, but whatever it is, Ramakrishna, you have made simple and people have to be sensitized about it. Thank you, sir. Good talks.
Question to Dr. Ramakrishna. Sir, are you there?
Yeah, is there, sir?
Dr. Ramakrishna, there's a little confusion between what is audit and what is research. I know the technical, there are differences. We are a little bit ahead of schedule, so I'll give you about 5 to 10 minutes. Can you just take us quickly through the concepts of audit, what makes it up, and how it is slightly different from research or thesis writing? So, are you ready for that, Doctor?
Yes, sir. 1 second. I will start sharing the screen, sir. 1 second.
Yeah. Okay.
Meantime, Dr. Patta has any comments to make?
Sir, as Dr. Rajgopal Shenoy has rightly put it, and that's a very good initiative, I should say, to bring in these topics, because these topics are, first of all, not often spoken about, and two is, the audience also will quite little, because, and they all think that these are not for us, but I think it's time to sensitize people slowly to get into the group. I think it's a very good effort, sir, and I think we should continue doing this. Yes, Ramakrishna, sir?
Sir, my screen is visible, sir?
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
Okay. So we have made one small module on audit and research, just to impress upon you what is audit, what is research, and what is the difference between that. These are the modules that Dr. Lakshman was already telling. We are at the second module of this. So this is what I was covering. So the basic thing is, recently there have been paradigm shift. The way we are practicing, the way we used to practice 20 years back is not the same here. Now, the more stress is based on the evidence-based practice, and because of the health tourism, you get patients from all over the country or maybe from different countries also. You want to show what is the quality of your services to bring them or attract them. So you need to do audit and give the data, show what is your quality, whether you are comparing well with the international standards, then you can get more number of patients and attract patients. And the other problem is when the patient has become consumer, we are all dragged to consumer court. Again, we need to have evidence for whatever decision we take, whatever advice we give to the patient. So this consumerism has affected our practice in a big way. And recently, patient's autonomy has been given more stress. Gone are the days when there is a family physician, whatever he says, the patient used to accept it as a gospel. But now it is not so. You have to discuss the pros and cons, various options available, everything with the patient, involve him in the decision making, and take his opinion, whatever he says. Ultimately, if you think something has to be done, and if the patient says, no, I don't want this, I want the second option, then you are forced to do the other thing. For example, I advise open surgery and laparoscopic surgery for inguinal hernia. If patients want open surgery, I will do open surgery. If he wants laparoscopy, I do laparoscopic surgery. That means patients' impression is also important. So an answer to all this problem is the accountability. Whatever decision you take, whatever treatment you advise, you are accountable for that, and be transparent. Explain everything, pros and cons, and the complications or risks involved. Everything you tell them, and you try to do audit, retrospect your results. See whether your outcome, your results are comparing well with the accepted standards, and try to do some research activity also. All these things makes you a complete surgeon. Just operating is not enough nowadays, and you have to be computer savvy, because whatever we are seeing now, to get all this information, do this research work, everything, you need a computer. Without computer, it is not possible, or it is difficult to do all these things. So this is the audit definition. What is important is it is explicit criteria and recognized standards. These are set by standard institutes which are available on the internet also. You try to compare your data with the accepted norms and see whether you compare well with that. Another simple way to put audit as, if you look at the dictionary meaning, audit means to examine or to scrutinize. That is the dictionary meaning of audit. This is another simple definition I found. It's a critical analysis of structure, process, outcome, and if it is not to the accepted standard, adjustments are made to bring about improvement. That is improving the system. Audit is concerned with improving the system. That's the important thing. Why we must do audit? Because the moment you know that somebody else is scrutinizing your results, looking at your outcome, standards, then your mind undoubtedly concentrates on the best possible way to give the best results. So that's how the patient care improves. Other aims of the audit are, it is to identify and improving, maintaining the quality of the care for the patient. Some system, you are working in some hospital, there is a system, and just look at it, whether whatever you are practicing, whether it is acceptable or there are some lacunae we have to improve. So these things you have to find out. This is the main aim of audit. Because you are looking always at the best results, you have to be updated in your knowledge. Look at the latest practice, what is the evidence-based practice, and that's how your knowledge also increases, and you will be always up to date in your knowledge. That is another side product of the audit. And because with the available resources only, you have to give the best results. So what you do, you try to utilize the available resources to the maximum extent. That means optimal utilization of the resources available to give the best results. This is also possible because of the audit. If you don't do audit, and if you are satisfied with whatever results you are getting, you will never try to make use of the resources. So this is the aim of the audit. The most important thing I want to stress is, the aim of the audit is only to improve the patient care, improve the system. That's all. It is not to name, blame, and shame a particular clinician. If you are working in a group hospital where group of doctors are available, are working together, if you identify a particular person and say this person's outcome is not good, then it becomes name, blame, shame game. This game should not be done. What happens if you do involve in this negative incentive? That particular clinician, he will perceive audit as a threat, and he will not cooperate with you. He will not report an adverse event. It may be a complication or death. So he tries to hide it. If he hides this, what happens? It results in repetition of the same mistake again and again in the system. So the system will not improve. On the other hand, it will deteriorate. That is the problem of negative incentive. So this again, the same thing, I am putting it in some other words. Always look for what is wrong, not who is wrong. This is important. What is wrong is important. Who is wrong is not important. Try to improve the system. Audit is always perceived as a cycle. It's an ongoing process. It's not it's a never ending thing. Means you observe the system and select, choose a topic. That means the problem areas you have to find out by observing the system. We can divide this audit into three things: planning, audit, and action, for convenience sake. So let us take one by one. During planning stage, you are going to observe the system, see what are the lacunae there, and based on that, you have to select a particular topic. For example, you are looking at the hospital records of wound infection. You think recently the wound infection rates have increased. Then what you have to do, now the question is whether our wound infection rates are higher than expected or it is acceptable. This is the question. This is the topic you have selected. Now you have to see the agreed standards of the best practice. For that, you have to search internet. There is another separate session in the next module, how to search internet to get the information, literature search, all those things are there. And there are certain websites and institutes which gives the standard acceptable norms, like the Center for Disease Control, or there may be compendia to give the sources. So with that, you find out what is the acceptable norm, and based on that, you define a methodology. Now you know the surgeries are divided into clean cases, clean contaminated, contaminated, and septic. So you divide your patients into your surgeries into these four categories, start collecting the data. This is the methodology. So this planning and methodology are over now. So once you have decided the method, then you go for the actual audit. Sometimes you may need to do some pilot study just to iron out any of the problems you're likely to face while doing this audit. And sometimes if you are perfect, this may not be required. Then the actual audit phase will start. That means you are going to collect data depending on the type of study methodology you are using. And then you put it in you compile the data, put it in the form of a table or something else, analyze the data. Here the various statistical methods come into picture. You may require help of a statistician, and then you have to report it. For example, this is the study. Our hospital wound infection for different categories, we have got this, and this is the accepted one. Now you compare it, apply tests of significance, see whether our data, our infection rate is up to the acceptable level, or it is more or it is less. If it is acceptable level or less than acceptable level, it's fine. If it is more than that, then the action phase will start, because it's your results are not acceptable. If it is okay, still you need to do audit, because you want to maintain that improvement. For that also audit is required. If it is not acceptable, that means your efficiency is less than acceptable limit, you need to go for action phase based on the recommendations. Here you may have to consider or consult some experts, or again read literature. What are all things you have to do to decrease this infection rate? Maybe your antibiotic selection is wrong, or autoclaving method is wrong. Maybe your staff is not following aseptic precaution. All those things you have to observe, make recommendations, and suggest changes. What are the changes you want to do to improve the result? Then in the next phase, you implement these changes and observe, continue to observe, and do the audit again. Means whatever I have told in the beginning, do it again. Now you will see that the infection rate must have come down. So if it is okay, continue to do audit to maintain the improvement. If it is not okay, just repeat the cycle again. So this is a cycle, audit cycle. What are all you can audit? See, you can audit structure of a system, process, or an outcome. What are the structures? See, how much time you are taking to shift the patient from ward to the OT, or after consultant says you can discharge the patient, how much time it takes for the patient to get discharged and get out of the hospital, how long patient has to wait in the outpatient department before he sees the consultant. These are all the structured things. So these things you can audit, and you may want to audit a process, something like putting up a central venous catheterization, or putting a intercostal drainage tube, IV cannulation. For all these things, there are set standards. This is the way you have to do, and you just see whether your staff are following the same thing. If they are not following, maybe you are maybe getting some complications because of that wrong process. Means if you are not following the exact the method of catheterization, means urinary catheterization I'm talking, you may be having higher number of UTI. That may be because of wrong method. If you do audit of catheterization, you will know your UTI rate is more, so you will suggest how to improve it. So these are the process. You may want to audit outcome. This is most commonly we do, like infection rate, recurrence rate, incisional hernia after laparotomy. These are all outcome, or a mortality. So these things also you can audit. Some people, they confuse audit with research. There are certain similarities in the methodology. Means you are going to collect the data, put a protocol, and then use statistics. All those are a little similar, but the basic difference is research involves acquisition of new knowledge, and audit involves improvising an existing system. So this is the slide Dr. Shivram has already shown. The research has got a hypothesis, it has got a research question, and you are going to set up a method to test that hypothesis, whether this research question is true or wrong. And in the end, you are going to prove or disprove your hypothesis. Whereas audit, it doesn't have any hypothesis. There is no research question. It just measures your performance again at a set standard. So how to get a set standard? It is through some standard institution which are giving recommendations. You are going to test it against it and see whether you compare well or not. If you are not comparing well, then you have to make certain adjustments to improve your results. This is the aim of the audit. Research asks what is the right practice, whereas audit asks, are we doing this right practice? This is another basic difference. And for any research, usually there is a study period. Whenever you read a journal, they always say the study starts from January 2018 to January 2020, something like that. And when the study period is over, that research, that particular study ends, and they are going to give the results and conclusions. Whereas audit, it's an ongoing process. It's a cycle, what I have already shown. There is no end for the audit. You should keep on doing it lifelong. The most important thing is the qualities of the scientist. The scientist must have the integrity. This is the most important thing. Although other things are there, he should be incisive, he should be innovative, he should be intelligent. All these things are there, but integrity is one of the most important qualities of a scientist and quality of a researcher or even surgeon. That is most important. You all know recently 2 articles have been retracted from. One is from Lancet, another from New England Journal of Medicine. Here, probably the integrity of the researcher was questionable. What it resulted, that person, she was terminated from the job. So these things should not happen. We have to be very transparent in our results, or collecting the data, and we should not cook up the data just to give better results to one particular group. That's most important. So research also is considered as a cycle, and this has been this will be dealt in more detail in the next module. Just one simple thing I wanted to tell. Initially, you have to think, whenever you are practicing, sometimes you come across a problem and you don't know what is the answer. Just look at the literature. Most of the time you will find an answer for your question. If you don't find an answer, that becomes a research question. That's important. So once you get a research question, try to formulate a hypothesis. Based on the hypothesis, you have to write a detailed protocol, writing everything down and in detail. And then sometimes you may need to seek collaboration, because the modern clinical trials, one person cannot do all the part. It's not a one-man show. You have to collaborate with your colleagues, and sometimes funding may be required, but most of the studies what we do in our medical colleges, they do not need much funding, and most of them are done free for the patient. So then you have to collect the data, analyze the data, then interpret it. So here you may require medical statistics help. And After that, based on the data, you have to draw conclusion. The most important thing here is whatever conclusion you give, it should be backed up by the data what you have studied. Means your main body of the article must give data to support your conclusion. And only such conclusion you must mention. Even if you mention single conclusion backed up by solid data, that is much better than drawing 10 conclusion with little or no data. See, most of the time, this is what our postgraduates make the mistake. They would have studied only one criteria. For example, laparoscopic surgery has got less pain. They would have studied, given data for pain score, all those things. And in the conclusion, they say early return to life, early return to work, then it is cost effective. So many things they will mention, but there is no data for all those conclusions in their study. This is not acceptable. So whatever data you give, your conclusion should be based on the data and give only such conclusions. Okay, now you have answered that research question. After that, you want to share your experience and this research outcome with your colleagues. So you present it as a paper in a conference, or you can write an article published in a journal. So what happens when the clinician read it, they take this knowledge, apply it clinically, and then that becomes a standard practice. Then again, the cycle completes. This is another thing what we call research cycle. The most important thing for any research is the informed consent. You must spend some time with the patient, explain him what is the purpose of the trial, how you are going to select the patients, what is the methods you are going to apply. If it is random allocation, you must also tell them that you may or may not receive the active ingredient if it is a drug, or if there are two types of surgery, patient doesn't have choice to choose the surgery. He will be put in one of the groups. So these things you must mention, how the patient is going to be monitored, how is the follow-up, whether he has to spend some money for that, or it will be paid, any investigation, all those things, and what is the end point you are going to measure. And most important thing is, after explaining everything, patient has got the right to accept or reject your proposal. He may not want to participate in your study. He has got right. That also you must tell the patient. He is not obliged to say yes always. And even if he says yes in the beginning, after starting the trial, he has got the right to walk out of the trial without giving any reasons. That option is also there for the patient. You must tell this directly, and then you have to take the consent. So all these things you must explain in presence of a witness, and take the consent, take the signature of the witness as well as the subject, and then only you can involve him in the study. This is the gist of informed consent for trial. You must always go through this. Without that, if you include any subject, it is not acceptable. Okay, to summarize, the research and audit, they are integral part of the surgeon's life. They make the surgeon complete. So without doing these things, just operating is no longer acceptable. You have to give your data, contribute to research. That makes you complete surgeon and useful for other colleagues also. Thank you, sir. Thank you for patiently listening. If any questions are there, we can accept now.
Thank you, Dr.
Rajan sir, we have 5 more minutes. We have to go
Yeah.
to the next one.
Yeah,
Sorry.
thank you, Dr. Ramakrishna. Again, that was brief and nice to know the smaller differences between audit and research. There's one question that has come up in the chat box, of a little technical question on what is propensity score matched analysis. Can you give a brief answer to the Dr. Ashwin Rammohan?
No, I didn't understand this question, sir. What is the propensity score? Means what?
Propensity score matched analysis.
No, I don't know for this. I have not come across this word.
I felt it was a very advanced form of statistical breakdown of data. I'm sure we need to look at a textbook for that. This is what I'm trying to say, that these courses and these initiations are into basics, into the very simple, so that you understand things for yourself. And remember, all research and all activity that goes towards theses and other things must have a statistician sitting with you. Now, when you have the statistician on your side, then you are able to get these things analyzed and you yourself will understand it much better. Dr. Patta, can I just share my screen, please?
Sure, sir.
Has it come up?
Yeah, it has. Yeah.
These are the two little books that we have that are available, as Dr. Sopimat has pointed out. These are at Dr. Ramakrishna's website. This is downloadable as an e-book. This has been very carefully and nicely put together by Dr. Lakshman and Dr. Ramakrishna, and it gives you all the basic things that we have spoken about this afternoon. As also, it will help you to prepare for the 2 sessions that follow this program in the next week, where we will look how to critique and how to really write out research papers. The other thing is that Dr. Ramakrishna's own book, Medical Statistics, is available for beginners. It's a Springer book and it is on Amazon and you can easily get it. It's well worth keeping it. Believe me, it is a nice book to be had with ourselves. And because I've been with Dr. Patta recently, there was a talk on the process of the thesis, what all you go through, the various steps you go through. That I'm not didn't talk about choosing the topic, but once you've chosen, how you go about the whole thing. It's available on this YouTube link, or you can just go to the LGS website, Facebook page, and you can click and get it, and you'll get an idea of how to go about these things. So with that, I think we can draw this evening session to a close. I'd like to thank Dr. Patta for having us on the main platform of LGS, as also Dr. Lakshman for putting together these modules. We have benefited greatly by listening to Dr. Shivaram and Dr. Ramakrishna. And I think it is on the 8th of August, we come back again for the remaining 2 modules of this little initiative that we are trying to push to all people, so that all students and all faculty, so that you get an idea of these terms and work in the right direction into the future. With that, I'll draw this to a close, sir. Dr. Patta, you can take over.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you for the initiative, wonderful initiative, and it's excellent people coming together. And it's a privilege for learning general surgery. And I thank Dr. Rajan, Dr. Shivaram, Dr. Lakshmanan, and President of the Karnataka State Chapter of ASI. And we hope we'll have many more of these. And we'll see you again in the coming Saturday meeting, sir. Thank you all. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Dr. Sopi, for your presence.